Welcome to Planetary Choices, a podcast produced by Center for New Critical Politics and Governance at Aarhus University. With this podcast, we invite you into our research lab, where we explore the key questions of today. We bring together scholars, policymakers, and activists who are engaged in sustainable planetary stewardship. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to this new episode of Planetary Choices, where I talk to Federica Genovese in order to learn more about climate politics and policy. This will be published in our new season on global governance beyond neoliberalism. Federica is a specialist in South-South analyses. She is a professor of political science and international relations at Oxford University, a fellow at St. Antony's College. She's working on international and comparative political economy, climate politics, and policy. And I'm interested already in how politics and policy relate in your head, and I'd love to talk about that. Questions of globalization and the effect of climate politics on globalization and vice versa, on redistribution, and also politics of crisis. So Federica has a lot to say about the world as it is today, and I'm very happy that you're here with me.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe we can start this by you telling us a little bit where you come from, what got you there, and what keeps you obviously very busy now.
Great. Yes, so I've been working on climate politics from various angles since my PhD years, which feel like a long time ago at this point. I started off with the question around international climate negotiations, because back in the 2000s, that was really the tool that we had to address issues around emissions and abatement, and how to decarbonize energy, how to address climate change. In my dissertation years, in my PhD, I tried to parse who wants what from international climate negotiations, what type of agreements, but also what type of conflict emerge at the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So for all intents and purposes, for a while, especially when I was a graduate student, I was studying essentially the international level of climate politics, the collective decisions at the supranational level. And it was quite clear as I studied those negotiations closely that actually a lot about climate action, climate politics was not only coming from institutional disagreements and structural differences at the sort of highest international level, but really a lot of the conflicts were embedded in internal conflicts within the countries that were negotiating. So this became a pretty clear theory that emerged as I was reading a lot of documents and going to a couple of the COPs back in the late 2000s, early 2010s.
Okay.
And then from there, essentially, I just followed how climate politics has evolved. And as we know, climate politics has become more and more of a hot central domestic politics issue in a lot of countries. And so I started looking at it from an institutional internationalist perspective and following how climate politics has progressed and developed across the years. I also ended up studying how people think about climate politics, what type of actors within democracies and weaker democracies position themselves on what has become a mass conflict around climate policies and climate change. So that's where I came from, and that's where I got to through this, I guess at this point, like 15 years of research on climate politics.
Well, it's no wonder that you stick to it, because a lot, as you say, a lot is happening and it's so topical. And you wake up one day and then you wake up the next day and things seem to change, and there's a new political angle and there's a new global event that is also related to climate change, I guess. In many ways in climate politics. But maybe let's start out, or let's take a step back. What are climate politics? And you also mentioned, just a second, you also mentioned policy. And how do you see it? Do you see a difference there? And where do you see that difference? Or maybe start with what are those climate politics? if you were to define them?
So climate politics is the process of making collective decisions across society, within society, and across societies. And in many ways, climate politics is a representation of where a lot of other types of politics is at, which is how power renegotiates itself and how resources get distributed. Climate policies are the levers, the sort of like solutions that we know could be put forward in order to address what are the intrinsic problems around climate change. When we talk about climate policies, effectively, we are talking about two types of levers, so two sort of categories of solutions, one being mitigation related policies. So policies that seek to effectively decarbonize the processes that we know, the modern economy, modern industries are embedded in, which are very greenhouse gas intensive. And the whole point about mitigation is effectively to take out the emission producing part of all economic activities that we know the global 21st century society is, essentially featuring. While the other axis of climate policy, the other dimension, if you will, the other category of climate policy levers has to do with adaptation. This only has become more salient in recent years for a number of factors, including the fact that climate change and the climate crisis is accelerating. So it is also because effectively hard scientists tell us that a bunch of carbon emissions are at this point locked into the atmosphere, and we will have to live with them even if we mitigate and decarbonize very quickly. So climate policies in themselves, from a theoretical perspective, they're not, there's not a big debate on them. Like, we know the mitigation can work. We have the technology to make it work. Similarly, adaptation, we sort of, there is an agreement among the sort of like natural sciences so that, how adaptation should be worked out and that it can be effective. The reason why climate policies become political is because bringing theory to practice and implementing mitigation or adaptation policies in the real world has distributional implications. And that means that there will be people, parts of society, groups, sometimes states that will bear the costs of implementing mitigation and adaptation policy more than others, or there will be more distinct concentrated winners from implementing mitigation and adaptation policies. So climate change, climate action, climate policies become political, are quintessentially political because they have this distributional nature, this distributional implications.
That also, it sounds like there's also a bit of friction between the two, politics and the policy, right? I mean, if we have, let's say, a COP agreement and that becomes an international, theoretically, legally binding agreement, that it needs to be enacted. And we talk maybe about also transitional justice problems here and these relations. So could you maybe dwell a little bit on the friction or contestation between those policy frameworks and the politics?
Well, so policies are in the climate sort of scenarios and the climate, field are most efficient and most effective at the international level. That's because emissions are a global public good problem. Essentially, it doesn't matter where or what produces more emissions. At the end, they get all locked in the atmosphere that we all share, and the catastrophes and the natural disasters that are magnified by the greenhouse gas effect, we all feel, right? So that's essentially why it was natural in the late 80s and 1990s to think of a solution at the international level, because international coordination would be the most efficient level to deal with this global public good problem. The policies that were identified, that were, framed, and to some extent with caveats agreed upon at the COP at the international political level, they only are effective to the extent that countries implement them, because we don't have other ways to do it.
Yeah.
And that's where the friction comes in. that's where sort of like that, distance between theory and practice starts creating problems. It's all fine and good to have very big minds and for all intents and purposes, nominal, representatives of countries to make agreements and take decisions at the international level. A lot of them, in good faith, across, for example, the 1990s, have identified what the best tools to address emissions and adaptation problems were. There's nothing wrong with, for example, the carbon markets and the carbon pricing mechanisms that were discussed in the 90s. The problem is that they can be theoretically as good as you think. We can imagine what the best price of a ton of carbon should be everywhere around the world. But how do you implement it? You need to bring it back to the countries. And that's where problems begin because that's where the politics start becoming more heated.
Sure, but there's also maybe a problem with just framing it as a market.
There is, yes, but I actually think that there is a problem with the way we have been thinking about politics in general and policies in general in the 1990s. Let's remember the historical moment. This is a moment in which we were coming out of the Cold War, and when I say we, the world really was coming out of the Cold War that had featured, the bipolar system since World War II. For intents and purposes, the US, if we will, was the winner of that, period.
Yeah.
And with the US coming out as the hegemon, victorious of, the Cold War and effectively being vouched to be determining where international politics was going for at least one decade or maybe two, the world accepted that a lot of the vision, a lot of the sort of like political norms of the US were going to be exported and were going to be featured in international organizations that were going to be motivating policies around the world. And those policies are market policies for the most part. The policies that the World Bank, the IMF, or for that matter, the UN from a Convention on Climate Change pushed for in the 90s and early 2000s were very much neoliberal market policies. So yes, there is an issue with that. There is an issue with whether those policies actually could fit all polities in the same ways. But I think that there is also a more inherent problem with assuming that international organizations, even if it wasn't with the eyes on markets, whether international organizations have, the teeth to actually being able to implement things at the local level. Because the real problem with climate politics is I keep on saying that it's a global problem, right? Like,
Okay.
it's about massive systems, but it can be felt within neighborhoods.
Definitely. So you already described with the Glocal system that, okay, there's a relationship here between local politics, national politics, and what may be called still global governance culture of creating knowledge and policies and regimes. But arguably, okay, we've moved on from the 90s. Things have changed, and we look at things more critically today. In terms of marketizing these carbon markets and these carbon emissions. But now we're in another period of change. So global governance institutions are delegitimized on various levels. Do you see that having an effect on climate negotiations and politics?
Sure, no, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of caveats and a lot of deficiencies that came with the international liberal order that was solidified in the 90s and, championed at least until, the mid-teens, the mid-2000 teens. But it doesn't mean that a world in which international organizations, international diplomacy, international governance is problematized and is a better one, right? Again, because despite all the deficiencies, this is a debated point in the political science literature, but despite all these deficiencies of the international organizations of the 1990s and 2000s, I think that they determined a path. And in many ways, actually, the Paris Agreement of 2015 had the huge spillover effect on the way, for example, NGOs that were pushing for climate action within Europe felt legitimized by the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement really tried to shift the conversations about global governance around climate change. It was an agreement, an accord that had understood that the market and neoliberal policies of the Kyoto Protocol were not actually delivering and yielding the results. Tried to flip the way to think about climate policies and climate politics, giving a lot more responsibilities to nation states and members of the UNFCCC, while the Kyoto Protocol and the way we had done COPs and had done policy making in the UNFCCC before that really was a more top-down technocratic approach.
Yeah.
But surely, I mean, on the one hand, this gave, as I said, a lot of fuel, a lot of legitimacy to a lot of bottom-up progressive forces that wanted climate action, because they anchored their mission around the Paris Agreement. But obviously, they also became, it made the COP, it made the international organizations more actively involved in politics, which can backfire. And to some extent, it's not a surprise that Trump twice decided to take the Paris Agreement as the example of an international organization that he wanted the United States to abandon as quickly as possible, because in his mind and in the minds of some of the far-right populists around the world in the past 10 years, the Paris Agreement represents exactly that type of international organization is reaching too far, essentially.
Yes, it's reinterpreted as breaching nation state sovereignty, right? And to put it simply, I mean Trump's vision of the United States as basically some kind of club where people go and they share their problems. Yeah, I have a problem with that. I have a problem with that. Let's make a deal about negotiation, which abandons all kinds of ideas of an international legal framework or some kind of more transnational or global policies that are even legally binding that would then tell sovereign nations to act accordingly. That, of course, is that's a problem. And it's highly contested. You might even say that there's politics happening on that level of policy making, quite some degree. Yeah.
Politics is everywhere.
Politics is everywhere. Yeah. So what are the politics then? I mean, you study a lot what's happening in the global South. So why is that important to highlight? Why is there an importance to focus on that more and more? And what is it like? So what are the contestations that are happening in the global South? What are the main issues there?
Right. So the reason why political science policymakers, people that study international politics should spend more time thinking about the global South is, barely put, that most of the population of the world is around there. And if we go back to the point that climate change is a global public good problem, then we really need to study the world and how the world is doing moves about this, because it's all good and fine to think about, say, Europe decarbonizing and trying to adapt as much as possible to future climate events. But if the entire world is going a different direction, surely this will not protect Europe, or will still make Europe involved in global supply chains that for all intents and purposes are still carbon determined, carbon denominated. I study the global South also because there are a lot of countries that are becoming increasingly pivotal to where we're going. I'm especially interested and especially focused on emerging economies. So low to mid income countries in the global South, for example, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa. And those are interesting countries because they're very hungry for development. They're very hungry for faster economic growth. They have some of the conditions for, on the one hand, being big culprits to the climate problem, because if not decarbonized, those are going to be countries that are going to be very energy hungry. They're going to consume a lot of fossil fuels. But on the other hand, there are countries where there is an awareness of the fact that first of all, fossil fuels could be problematic for themselves to begin with and for the global community, but also there are enough natural resources that are not carbon dependent that allow for some of the green movements within those countries to actually have some credibility. So the reasons why these countries are so interesting because the polarization between fossil fuel assets and cleaner, environmentally sustainable groups and asset owners is very strong. And you really can study where climate politics is at around the world if you study, coalitions of pro-fossil fuels versus sustainable energy in Brazil, for example, or where you study constituencies that are very coal dependent versus constituencies that are very afraid of flooding in Indonesia.
Right. I'd love to know, I mean, you said study those contestations. How do you actually do that? I mean,
Yeah.
what do you study? Coalitions? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I guess like I am a political economist. You could be studying this in various ways. So
Sure.
I have colleagues, obviously, that have been tracing electoral behavior or that have been much more focused on really tracing sort of how elites and politicians speak about these issues. I have done a little bit of that, but a lot of my work is either on the actual stakeholders, so trying to study um, essentially the industries, the firms that are involved in this type of investments. But I've also tried to trace public opinion. I haven't done work on China, I should say this. So obviously China being a very fascinating case of a country that is single-handedly going to provide a lot of potential solutions, at least from a technical
Yeah, is
perspective.
China somehow mentioned in these countries that you study? Because a dream of the ecological civilization in China, I wonder
Yeah.
whether this is somehow inspirational or whether this.
So I have studied China only to the extent that when I've done my more international level type of studies, where I've traced where states stand on various issues discussed at COPs, obviously China was one of the many states that give statements that I was studying, but I haven't done within China studies. Part of the reason why I have not done within China studies is because, again, especially from the sort of like public opinion perspective, it's less relevant in China. It's obviously not a democracy, and I'm more interested in sort of like democratic coalitions or essentially the conflict between stakeholders that have some type of legitimacy and accountability within democratic institutional infrastructure. China is a completely different world in that sense, obviously. But I think that China has become a fascinating model for the type of emerging economies that I was talking about. So yes, I'm not an expert of Chinese politics per se, but China comes in because China is representing a new different model to how to do energy differently. It's not necessarily the model of how to do climate politics. Climate politics and energy politics overlap, but they're not exactly the same. But as I said, China is definitely making moves in the global south in very significant ways, to some extent boosting, sometimes actually boosting the power of fossil fuel stakeholders, like if you think about investments in coal in Indonesia, but in other ways providing, a vision of a state that is electrified and that is full of renewables. So that is certainly the case in Brazil, where essentially a lot of electric vehicles now are purely provided by Chinese supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, there's this tension, of course, or this overlap between a new technology that comes out of China has embraced maybe more than other countries that you are an expert of, and this fossil fuel driven, I guess, industry, large industry, and politics around it. Politics, of course, of interest. I mean, if you were sometimes, I think, if you were to put the fossil fuel logic on the geopolitical and geoeconomic world map today, it would pretty much explain a lot of what's going on. From sanctions against India, in the Russian-Ukraine conflict and war, to any or the actions of American foreign policy, to maybe negotiations and the positioning of those countries that you're an expert of. So how do you see a correlation there? What's your take on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at geopolitics now, and especially since the return of President Donald Trump in the White House, in many ways, what you see is what some people are calling an emergence of climate realism, which, is a very
Okay.
loaded concept. It's a
What is
very
that?
controversial concept. We could spend a whole hour just talking about this, but in essence, some pundits, but also some think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations are putting forward the fact that we're now in a world in which every country is for their own, but they need to sort of like still live with the fact that climate change is real. So it is an awakening to the fact that with some forces starting from the United States wanting to be more introspective, wanting to be a little bit more selfish, wanting to be more their nation first, we're now in a world in which
A little more.
well, yeah, exactly. But we are now in a world in which technology, there will be a zero-sum game conflict around acquiring technology that preserves the energy capacity of each country. And that will be a much less sentimental and moralistic sort of like approach to energy than the one, for example, that the Paris Agreement and the Green Decade between, I guess, Paris Agreement and US elections
Mhm.
have loaded on, for example, the need to decarbonize. But at the same time, it is a philosophy, so to speak, like this climate realism school, if you want to call it like that. It's also trying to make this glue with the fact that climate change is not disappearing. And so again, they like to call themselves realists, but at the core, it's a very cynical way of looking at what it means to be a country that, on the one hand, needs to be energy sovereign, but also that needs to confront the fact that the climate change is not disappearing and they will kill people. And it's a view that I think the new geopolitical changes and certainly the new wars and all the new decisions that the White House with Trump is taking since February 2025, it's manifesting, but it is not. I don't think. I think it's an interesting question. What this will do to the world as a whole, because we know that the U.S. is a very, very important country in the global landscape, but it's not the only country.
Mm.
And again, it's we're probably right now in a world in which there's less hegemony than there was in the 1990s. And again, China does not necessarily want to lead, doesn't want to be hegemon, but de facto has huge capacity in international relations. So, willing or not, China is becoming a new pole. Certainly is very interested in keeping its power in that side of the globe that where it's geographically located. Um, and China is not, I mean, China is in many ways a carbon giant because it's very, very, very energy hungry, but it is electrifying at the speed of light. And um, so it's an interesting moment because, yes, the geopolitical tensions and certainly the wars that the US is getting involved in are reaffirmation of a fossil fuel type of world. But I think that we don't know whether that is linearly correlated with a death of climate politics, or I think it's a much more complicated, has much more complicated and splintering consequences. It might actually foster the energy transition more than we think.
No? Okay. What makes you say that?
Because there will be a lot of countries, just like with the Russian attack on Ukraine, countries that just want to decouple from the US. And if the US is
No. Okay.
effectively a petrostate, if the US is exporting a vision of the world that is fossil fuel energy oriented, as long as it's essentially at the benefit of US fossil fuel multinationals and the revenues of the US state, some countries may not be excited about this. I mean, you speak from Denmark. So you know exactly how there are definitely a lot of pushes within Denmark to decouple from the US, and that
Well, we have the Greenland story as well on top of it.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, that is in many ways an energy story. And as I said, the energy and climate are not always overlapping. They don't need to overlap. Politically, maybe they don't overlap, but effectively, there is a lot of, linkage between these issues. Um, and if you have a big enough constituency of nations around the world that wants to decouple from a nation that is very selfish, very fossil fuel oriented, that is starting war, so you might actually end up in a world in which you might not be decarbonizing as we wanted to, but that may be an unintended consequence.
Mm. There are, of course, also some who say that now that the US has pulled out of so many organizations, they can finally go and do the job. There's less conflict. There's more room to move on with some aspects of policies. Yeah. Well, this is fascinating, of course, and it's highly relevant. And I wonder whether you can elaborate a little more on your expertise on this comparative view that you have on global South countries that you enumerated, Indonesia, Brazil, and India in particular. And there's also this new project, or is it new or ongoing project, Varieties of Climate Vulnerabilities, that's the Leverhelm Trust project there. So has this become a moving target now that the world is changing basically on a day-to-day basis, or could you do that comparison? And how have climate politics in the global South changed? And do you see that this change has any effect on larger global governance structures?
Right. So the project started as in effectively we started working on this in January 2024. And since then, a lot of things have changed. When I was drafting, the proposal to the Livium to get the grant, we were still in a world in which we didn't know where the future was going to bring us, but we were effectively in a world in which Biden had just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and the U.S. for the first time had passed the biggest bill on climate
Yes.
that the country had ever passed. It was a fragile win, and I don't think that anyone thought that it would have been an easy feat, but like it was a different time. The Climate Vulnerability Projects, as we call it, University of Oxford, is trying to do various things. As you said, it has especially a global South sort of perspective, although not exclusively. Within the global, the reason we decided to focus on the global South is precisely for what I was saying earlier, which is in many ways it's actually a map. Emerging economies in the global South are a perfect lens to where we can and could be, or maybe we will end up being in this struggle between rather strong forces. And so this is, for example, harder to measure empirically in the context of Europe because, with the exception perhaps of Poland and Czechia, most fossil fuels in Europe are very much declining. And so even if we were not talking about climate change, even in a world in which this is not even a problem, they would be declining purely because in many places, both coal, if you look at coal in Spain, if you look even at coal in Germany or the North Sea, a lot of those basins are actually in many ways peaked. So it's less
peak oil.
less like oil. Yeah, exactly. So it's less evident. It's not impossible. In fact, Europe is still a relevant player where you can trace this type of internal conflicts, but it's less dramatic than in the global South. When we think about how many people are employed in coal in Germany, I mean, it is effectively less than 4% of the population, and I'm counting the whole supply chain of coal. But if you look at some parts of Indonesia, we're 40% of the population. Like in Samarinda, like we're talking about in some of the parts
That's
of
a
the
big number.
yeah, or like in some parts of Johannesburg in South Africa, like entire families depend in a way or the other from the wealth that coal produces regionally. So the politics are of a different scale when it comes down to fossil fuel decarbonization, energy transition in these countries. But equally, you could say the same about sort of like maladaptation, the costs of not doing adaptation. In Europe, we are vulnerable. There is a lot of coast. There is a lot of potential floods. We're seeing them we've seen these things actually accelerating very fast. Think about Valencia. I mean, I'm from Italy. There's been a lot of floods, very deadly floods, or even if not deadly, very dramatic floods in Italy in the past 3 years. But I mean, the human toll in the global south is a different scale, and frankly, the human toll in the global south has higher just purely because the global south has been more of a victim from climate change already for multiple decades. So this is why studying the politics there is fascinating, because it's really not that hard to really identify those communities, those individuals that are at the frontiers of these two dimensions of vulnerability. On the one hand, the vulnerability to an energy transition that could leave a lot of families, a lot of communities without any assets and without essentially any income.
Mm.
But on the other hand, a lot of the ecologically vulnerables, the people that are at the frontier of the death toll of climate. There is also, I mean, going back to your question about how this has changed since the beginning of the project, actually, I think that from a domestic perspective, this hasn't changed as much as you would think. And this is, again, because these communities actually, even if they don't speak specifically about climate change, which is ultimately a scientific and technical term, they understand the weather changing. And for all intents and purposes, they're not treating climate as a cultural war. Like it's not like in Europe or in the United States, where we're almost made this an issue purely for party politics and ideological purposes. They don't have that there. Another reason to study the global south, you don't need to have the extra layer of what do politicians do to sort of weaponize the issue. It doesn't happen like that there. It's really more like, are you willing to sacrifice at the margins growth rates and development trajectories if you think that that's for the purpose of saving your life? Because maybe we shouldn't develop at this rate, but maybe you should actually protect your ecosystem, which is not necessarily culture war. It's a very real, material, and legitimate political, debate. And in that sense, so I think that the Trump shock and the changes and the rise of the far rights in the global north is only affecting these countries to the extent that they feel they're more on their own. But I don't think that it has changed completely the salience of the issue. It might have provided at the margins more power to especially multinational corporations that extract fossil fuels to be able to double down, having to do less greenwashing, for example. But I don't think that, especially at the community level, at the public opinion level, that the conflict has shifted or has been reframed. It's more like the weights of the powers that characterize this bipolar discussion, they might have shifted to the extent that fossil fuels are now more empowered in the global south. But I think that we're still in a world in which, for example, if you look at Brazil, President Lula is very cross-pressured, right? Like President Lula, who represents, on the one hand, the left of Brazil, and that has the traditional legacy of representing labor, fields for concerns about sustainability and fields about concerns about the Amazon, for example, or for that matter, coastal problems of pollution, including fossil fuel-induced pollution. But on the other hand, especially because they feel very alone, very scarred by how Trump raised, sanctions for the Bolsonaro court trial, they don't feel like they should give up oil. And so,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned multinationals a little earlier, and I was wondering, since you have the national case studies, you talk about countries, and you study the companies that are involved in, as stakeholders. How many of them first of all, do you see a tension here between transnational companies and national companies? Or are they in agreement? Do they amplify each other? Or is there disagreement? Or
Yeah.
How is that going on? And is there a layer of climate finance in the whole discussion as well?
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
those are good no, those are great questions. So the countries that we've done field work last year were Indonesia and Brazil. So I can speak mostly about these two.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, if you will, we have a big data set that is backing all this field work. And again, that data set comprehends other countries that are still sort of like in this emerging economy. So as I said, India, South Africa, Colombia.
Hmm.
Um, so these are all countries precisely because they are in the mid rank of income scales. So they're obviously not global north type of industrialized countries by any means, but they're not least developed countries either. They're countries that, because of endogenous history, sort of dynamics, they've actually developed their own state-owned fossil fuels. So these, I guess what I'm trying to say is like these are in some countries, for example, in Brazil, the upstream is essentially dominated all by the national Petrobras, the national state-owned oil company.
Mhm.
But in Indonesia, for example, we're in a world in which there is a bit of oil, and that oil is in part extracted from Petromina, which is like the national oil company, but it's actually because of the geography of the country being a bunch of islands that are very extended and hard really geographically to be administered, there is actually quite a bit of licenses that are given to multinational oil corporations like Eni, for example, in Italy. When it comes to coal in Indonesia, instead, it's a lot of private licenses, but these private licenses are essentially only domestic. So you have different ways in which multinationals interact with local agents and local asset owners. And sometimes, in the case of oil, for example, is through one major state-owned company, but sometimes is actually with a bunch of, splintered private local asset owners. My sense, as you can imagine, it's hard to study these things very directly. But my sense is that ultimately there is a fair amount of reinforcement between the activity that multinational corporations and the national sort of asset owners of fossil fuels extraction have. I think that there's not a huge amount of conflict between multinationals and locals. But it doesn't mean that sometimes, especially multinationals, don't get politicized. So Chinese, mining in Indonesia has been a bit of a problem. Some politicians in Indonesia have complained about, or like they have taken some actions about how much some of the multinationals that do oil extraction redistribute revenue or, employ local labor. But I don't think this is as high scale. It's not as problematic. As yeah, from the countries that I know, it hasn't been that bad. And again, I think that to some extent it's purely coming from the way history has evolved. Like in Latin America, a lot of oil has been nationalized precisely because US oil multinationals were very aggressive, and so the country needed to come together with one state-owned oil company in order to push back against the US. In the southeast of Asia, it's a different story where there was not that type of aggression historically. So historically, the fossil fuels have developed differently.
And how is the situation, I wonder now, between those emerging economies, you say? So they're relatively big players. And I wonder what even smaller global South countries think of those. And we often relate, those countries to the global North. But what about small island states? What about Barbados or even smaller countries? How do they position themselves, or what's their relation there?
So
South.
I only studied this type of countries when I was studying international climate negotiations, and I've never been to small islands. I've only met in Bonn once, some of the people. that are representing this country. So, I would never be considered an expert necessarily of this type of internal politics within these countries. There are other studies, though, that point to what, the least developed countries or the famous members of the Alliance of Small Island States,
Yeah.
how they feel about all of this. I think that generally speaking, in the global south, surely there is also a sentiment of anti-colonialism that affects all of the stories around anything that is imported from the global north. And I would suspect that actually this is especially strong in the most vulnerable countries that have played less, they contributed less to the problem. So, for example, surely, I mean, in all of the countries that I mentioned earlier, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, like, I mean, there is a bit of eye rolling to the extent that, the global north should only to some extent to be and preaching about climate action because they are not responsible for the amount of carbon emissions that are right now stuck in the atmosphere, right? But I think that there's still a fair amount of understanding that they are contributing to the problem and that they are big actors. So new colonialism and issues of anti-colonialism in countries like Brazil and Indonesia are there, but are not as heightened. My suspicion is that in some of the least developed countries, there is even more of that sort of feeling that if if there's so little contribution to the problem by them, they should really not be giving an inch to the culprits. And going back to, you asked about climate finance. So climate finance, I think that is very much on ice right now. The biggest sort of climate transfers donors in the past decade were Europe to begin with, but like Japan had done a fair amount, and the US was doing some moves. I mean, there was this whole idea that Biden put to the fore about just energy transition program that they tried to lift up in countries like Indonesia and South Africa. That obviously went out of the window the moment that Donald Trump came back to the White House. But realistically, I mean, I think the European Union right now is silently trying to continue that, but I mean, Japan also has a new government that is more far right or more right than it used to be, and they don't seem to be necessarily playing the long game on climate finance. So I am afraid that what's going to happen is that the global south will be even less enchanted with the idea that they should be involved in climate politics and think about an energy transition if they're not going to get any compensation. And it's not likely that there are going to be significant climate transfers. So it's unlikely that there's going to be significant climate related compensation going forward. We shall see. I mean, we don't know. Like the European Union is a funny animal. Like, it is, the parliament is more far right or, more centered on the right than ever. But the commission plays sometimes, its own game depending on the issue area they can touch on. So we shall see. I'm not particularly optimistic, but
Hmm. Yeah, I sort of saw that coming, that by the end of our conversation, there's not a great optimistic scenario out there. But maybe, Federica, to kind of wrap it all up, when you pull all of your knowledge together, what do you think will evolve from here? Where will we be? I know it's a classic question and it's a difficult question, but I would just love your 2 cents on that.
yeah, I mean, I clearly, I mean, I think when you ask a political scientist where we're going to be, I think that some colleagues would certainly go with sort of like the vibes of the moment. I think that, surely, for example, there's going to be a lot of politics around AI that will dominate a lot of political discussions at all levels.
Yeah.
And there's only so much attention and spend that people, but also politicians can invest. And so you could expect that in the short to medium term future, climate will be on the, back burner. But But I actually don't think that that's how climate works. I actually think that even when people were commenting on the American presidential election campaign in the 2024 months, a lot of people, again, a lot of pundits were sort of saying like climate is completely absent from the campaign and this is not going to be a climate election and climate doesn't matter anymore. Well, that's not how it works. Like a lot of what we have seen is actually an active, artifacted suppression of climate discussion. So that in itself is a signal of climate politics being salient if one side really wants to suppress the conversation. And again, we're seeing right now a lot of conflict that yeah, maybe this may seem like 20th century, American, sphere of influence type of conflict, but actually our conflict to maximize resources that we know are very much directly causing the problem of climate change. Um, and again, I think that a lot of people seem to very caught up with identity politics issues, for example, with respect to transgender and LGBTQ rights, or again, AI. But I think that there is a climate story behind all of those things. We know that women and minorities in society, people that identify as minorities, they tend to empathize with vulnerables a lot. And there is a coalition of people, especially driven by gender inequalities and identity minorities that tends to back up climate action. And I think suppressing that has implications for climate. And the implications could be to the extent that you find new coalitions of antagonists to, say, the Trump regime precisely across those type of groups. And similarly with AI, I mean, we talk all the time about how AI is going to destroy white collar labor markets and that it's going to have implications for people that use computers. But actually, we don't know. We don't know. We just simply don't know where that will go and how work in the global north will be affected by AI. But I think that one thing that we know for sure this AI is energy hungry. And that is also another story that opens up a whole new conversation about how much should we really get caught by cultural war between fossil fuels and renewables when we know the renewables could actually be feeding data centers that are needed for AI. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't know if that's a pessimist versus optimist, but it's just that climate is not going to go away, and everything will be tainted by climate, if only because the crisis is accelerating and more people will be exposed. So we might really be just at a moment of the pendulum that wants to silence that conversation, but my suspicion is that quickly we'll move back in a world in which this will be center of a lot of discussions and maybe a world in which it doesn't get to be so polarizing from an ideological perspective, but goes back to a more grounded material sort of conversation. And in that sense, I always say this, but like the global south may be the future of where the global north is in climate politics because they've understood that there actually is an existential question that is purely material. And so maybe we'll get there here in the global north at some point again.
Would be nice if we could de-ideologize that climate element there. Federica, I always ask one final question, which is I copy it from my favorite podcast, which is called In Our Time. And there, the moderator always says, is there anything that you would like to talk about that you didn't get the chance to talk about because I was asking you the wrong questions? So is there anything on your mind right now where you think, oh, that needs to be up?
One thing that I certainly think about a lot as somebody that studies something that in some ways has such a non-linear, um, lifespans, like climate change has this weird features of being very slow burning and, requiring processes that are actually very hard to implement in the short term and that requires a very long-term perspective, but then also have very immediate crisis emergencies, right? Like, I feel like a lot about what climate policy requires is a combination of long-term democratic trust. So we need a return to trust in democracy, which we know has been declining and has been eroding and corroding. And China shows us that you can do energy policies that is very ambitious without a fully democratic government. But again, energy policies does not mean climate policy. China is not doing this for humanity. It's not doing it because he wants to preserve Chinese lives. there is a different project behind what China is doing with mitigation instruments and all of that. And I think if we want to do actual climate motivated policy, or if our energy policy should go hand in hand with climate, we really need strong democracy that has these long-term implications. But at the same time, I think that we shouldn't forget that everywhere in the autocracies or democracies, a lot of policy shifts are nonlinear, and they purely emerge from windows of opportunities. And I keep on talking about this because you really need sometimes a very short window of opportunity, like the invasion of Ukraine, like the first months of the COVID pandemic, to really start changing the conversation. Like that's really when during this crisis and this windows of opportunity, that's really when institutions have the microphone, and when some ambitious policy changes can be done. So I think going forward, I think for people that want to, let's say activists, they want to really push the climate policy agenda, or they want progress on the issue, I think it's a combination of those things that will be critical. A return to a belief that democracy can work, and that democracy is the regime to support, especially in places where democracy is backsliding, but also the idea that actually it's not undemocratic to use windows of opportunity, because sometimes you need to grab the attention when the attention is on you, essentially.
Well, that's more motivating. That sounds good. But it's a call, of course, to democratize the climate question, and to really build it in and de-ideologize, make it part of democratic processes, and that's a task for all of us, and that makes me a little more optimistic, definitely. But I can see there's a lot of research, there's a lot of new questions that you will follow up, and I hope to continue the conversation at another point in time, Federica. For now, I say thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Planetary Choices. This podcast is produced by the Center for New Critical Politics and Governance at Aarhus University. Visit our website and join us for another episode of Planetary Choices.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.